Okay, so before we start on today's material, I'm going to just use an example of some code that somebody had put up on Piazza. They were having trouble. In this particular case, there was some reason why they were thinking that argument error might be raised under these conditions, but it wasn't working right. If this is your code, I hope I have your permission to use it. You're safely anonymous. I only wanted to put this up here so we could sort of do a little kind of groupthink exercise. If this was your code, and you were trying to, under the correct circumstances, raise argument error, and it wasn't being raised, what are some strategies for debugging that you might try to sort of isolate the problem? What are some things that could go wrong here, and how might you try to modify the code to fix them? So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the first thing I think I would do is just shove in inputs.
OK, so the first thing you would do is try some inputs. So to make that simpler, I took the liberty of deciding to wrap this up in a function. So this way, we could just call the function with the inputs. And by the way, this is kind of a standard trick, right? If you've got a piece of code in the middle of a function and that piece of code seems to be at fault, pull it out into its own function and make the inputs and outputs of that function explicit. And when we talk about beautiful code and refactoring later, one of the things you'll see is that actually short functions are your friend for all kinds of reasons. But one reason is short functions are easy to test. OK, so we'll wrap it up. We'll put some stuff in it. But let's assume we do that and it's still not working. What are sort of, in terms of the scientific method, how would you start to narrow down the possible problem? Assuming that the symptom is we're expecting that argument error would be raised, but it's not being raised when we call it with a character that we think should raise it. What could we try to eliminate out? How can we simplify? Yes, sir? OK, so one thing is we've got an if here that's got 3 conditions. And if this is not happening, then it's reasonable to assume that all 3 conditions are false. The question is, if you test each of the conditions separately, what could you learn from that? Maybe one of the 3 clauses is not doing the right thing. So that's a thing you could do. What else could you do? Yes? Yes, so aggressively parenthesize, right? This Boolean expression appears to want to say, if it's not the case that the character matches this regular expression. However, depending on, if you look in the Ruby documentation, there's this question of, do the parentheses imply going around this whole thing, or do they enclose the bang as well? Or in the language of programming systems people, how tightly does the bang character, the exclamation mark, bind compared to how tightly this comparison character binds? Now, it's already the case, by the way. What's the thing I'm going to say next? That if you have to look it up in the documentation, if you have to look it up at this point, you probably should have parenthesized it anyway. Right? So there was this example I gave earlier on during the first week about it's possible to make code so concise that when you read it, you're actually not 100% sure how it works. And then you have to go check the documentation to make sure you understood it. This might be one of those examples where even if it turns out that the precedents of bang and matching regular expressions are what we would expect for this code, the fact that we have to think about it during debugging suggests that we should put the parentheses in anyway. The fact that we had to think about it is like that's already too much work for the programmer. So this is a case where putting the parentheses back in would possibly help debug it if that was the problem. But even if that's not the problem, it'll probably make the code more readable for the next person. Any other suggestions? Other suggestions? Notice I stuck bybug in there. If you were in my head, which you don't want to be, but if you were in my head, and what do you think I'm about to do? Once I run this code, it hits bybug, it drops me into the debugger. What do you think I'm going to be typing in that debugger? As a way of, yes, go ahead.
You type char, see what it is.
OK, so one thing I could type in the debugger is let's take a look at the value of char. Let's see if it's what I expect. And OK, let's say it's what I expect. What's another thing I would type into the debugger? Here's a hint. It's on the screen. Yeah? Yeah, exactly. So if I'm about to evaluate char against these 3 clauses, I could manually enter each one of those clauses into the debugger and see if the debugger says that it's true or false. So if there's a problem in how I express one of these clauses, one way to do it is manually evaluating each of those expressions at the moment in time right before the program would have done it. Right? So this is kind of you narrow down, and at some point you will figure out what the problem was. By the way, if you're in here and this was your code, did you ever figure out what the problem is? Because when I ran this code, it actually did the right thing. Is the owner of this code willing to identify themselves? I scraped it off of Piazza, and I honestly don't remember whose it was. But Okay, well, whatever. It seemed to work for me, so maybe there was something else going on. But I just wanted to sort of, get everybody in the habit of adversarially, what could you do, right? Think of it as you're trying to sort of match wits with the interpreter, and how much can you sort of fine tune and narrow in on what the problem might be. That's the debugging mentality. A couple of things based on sort of reading Piazza posts and also my interactions during office hours with various people and talking to the GSIs about their office hours. Let me just repeat a piece of advice that I've been giving, and there's sort of I can't say it too many times, and I call it knowing what you don't know. A technical colleague of mine used to have the saying that problems that seem to kind of go away by themselves tend to come back and bring their friends. So the way this applies to the work in this class is if you're having trouble getting something to work like in your code, it's great to Google, use Stack Overflow and stuff to figure out what might be going on. However, even if the Stack Overflow post or whatever says, to fix it, do this, don't do that. First, understand what's broken. If you apply a fix, even if the fix seems to work, if you didn't really understand what was broken in the first place, it's not clear that you've really applied the fix. You certainly haven't had the experience of fixing the bug. So you could argue that although the code maybe seems to do the right thing now, you don't really understand why it's doing the right thing, and therefore I claim you don't really understand if it's doing the right thing. So it's great to use the internet as a resource, but don't use it blindly, right? Make sure that before you apply any fix, before you change a single line of code in trying to fix a bug, make sure you understand why you're making the change. What is the hypothesis you're trying to test about why that specific change might actually make an improvement? Another version of this that I've seen is weeks of coding and debugging can save you hours of thinking. And yes, you read that right. I've seen comments from people saying, I feel like I spend more time looking up stuff on the internet and trying to figure out how something works than writing lines of code. And that's probably true. That's actually not that unusual. In fact, I think ironically, when you use a really powerful high-level framework, and Rails is an example, but if you move towards using React or Angular or Backbone, you're going to have a lot of the same experience. The frameworks do a whole lot in order to save you a bunch of grunge work. But that means that by definition, you're going to write less code for an app that accomplishes the same amount of things. So it's going to feel like you're not writing a lot of code. You might only write 3 lines. But if you think about how those 3 lines leverage what the framework is doing for you, those 3 lines actually are accomplishing a lot. So don't think of it in terms of how many lines of code have you written. Think of it in terms of how much new functionality have you managed to get to work. And it's kind of the partnership between you and the framework, which requires you to understand what the framework is doing. And yes, that takes a lot of time. And there's sort of no shortcut around that. But as you get more comfortable with any framework, you'll get to where you'll spend less time looking stuff up because you'll remember how you did it the last time. Right? It takes a while to get into that groove. And that's true of every framework you will ever use.